Hi everyone, this is our week 2 recording for this class. And again, a quick reminder with regards to your assessment, you're supposed to create a procedural asset. In fact, a couple of procedural assets, right? For this particular creative direction. So as I mentioned, we are creating assets for this film. And basically, it's like a sci-fi warehouse laboratory of some sort. But you have a good idea in terms of what the style is and what the look is with regards to the environment that we're developing assets for. So again, a reminder with regards to what you need to do. You need to do two procedural assets. Number one, it's the procedural industrial shelving, and then the second one is some sort of procedural rail or fencing. So with regards to the shelving, it might look something like this. Now again, we want a higher version of it, right? So we've done things like prototypes, but for this we want it to actually look really good. That means we want it to look, as high detailed as we can. So something like this. So procedural means we can easily expand or create different versions of it by just changing certain parameters for our asset. So we're creating some sort of Houdini digital asset. Now that's the first thing, which is the shelving. And then we want to create some sort of railing as well. So the rails, if you break it down, it has poles, it has the actual handles, and it has other things as well. So sounds, again, relatively straightforward, but again, we want it detailed, meaning it just can't be simple boxes or simple cylinders. You want that, modeled really well. So hopefully that's clear. And again, how you showcase this, and we'll talk about this as we move along. How we showcase this is by creating video demos of both of those assets, similar to what we did in our first challenge in week 1. Now, just to see what's happening in our challenge. And again, a really important thing here to understand is even if you're late and you haven't done the challenge, you want to engage on those challenge and submit later, but you still want to do it because again, it's part of the assessment and part of, your marks, but at the same time, it allows you to build on your first assessment. So make sure to do the best you can. But from what I've seen here, we have some really good results. So notice that a lot of you were able to achieve the parameters and achieve the things that we expect from this type of procedural asset. So great job there from Brennan, for example. And then we have Jared. And then see, so different style, but again, I guess same principle there. So it's a very procedural in nature as well. And then we have the rest of you providing some really good examples. So I usually just comment on problematic things, but what I see here are some really good examples with regards to creating procedural stuff. Now, if you need help with anything specific, for example, you can schedule a consultation so we can have a look at those. Then we can have a look at those problems that you have. So, for example, again, that one, extrusions, you might need help with the extrusions for this one. But again, it does have controllers there and you are able to change certain parameters as well. So great job from most of you guys. Again, if you haven't shared yet, then make sure to do it as soon as possible and engage in our challenges. So last week we had a look at some essentials, and I just want to expand and cover more techniques that will help you create these types of procedural assets. So perhaps let's have a look at certain principles, right? Now, lines and curves, for example, will be quite useful, especially when you're dealing with rails and stuff like that. But I'll show you why lines will be quite important later on. You have to be comfortable grouping and combining different groups because this allows you to create different types of assets and functionalities. We'll have a look at the transform and match size, which is something we've done. And then maybe have a look at importing objects and maybe switching objects. But for now, let's concentrate on lines and curves and why these are important. So what I'll do is I'm going to open Houdini. And as I mentioned, Houdini works with projects. So you have to go to File and then just set the project or create a new one. For me, I already have an existing project, which is this procedural assets that I'm working on. So I'll just set that project. But if you haven't created the project, as I mentioned, create a new one. And when you new one, you just create, a new project, specify the location first, and then it automatically creates your subdirectories there. Now, we're talking about curves and again, how to create curves. So what I'll do is I'm going to just close some of the windows there. So what happens is I have my network view and also my perspective view here. Now, I'll just turn on my grid so you can actually see what's happening. Okay, there you go. So, lots of ways to create a line or a curve, and the easiest way perhaps is under your Create tab, there's something there called Lines. And if you click on it and then just click and just press Enter, what will happen is it'll create a line. And that line will be created in the origin, and it also creates that line geometry that we see in our network view. If you go inside that line, it's basically one node. Okay, so it contains this geometry, but inside the geometry, under your geometry level, notice that you have one node there. And if I press P for properties, this allows you to see the properties of that particular line. Now, to make this easier, you know what, I'll just have the grid visible there. But just to show you, the line allows you to change the length. So that's the length of the line, but also the direction of the line. So for this one, it's the length and direction that are quite useful. The number of points, you don't even have to change it too much. 2 is fine as a starting point. But anyway, with the length, you can increase that to, let's say, 5, and then you have something taller. Now, the direction is actually quite important because currently the direction is set to Y. It's Y because you have 3 values there. That's actually X, Y, and Z. So if I zero out Y and actually bring this one to 1 in X, notice that our line is pointing towards the X-axis. I know it's the X-axis because you do have a visualization there of your axis. Now, obviously, if I change that to 1 here, now I have a line pointing towards the positive z-axis. You can make that negative as well if you want. So that's negative, and then you can even have values there. But for now, I'll just have that at 1 in the x-axis. And again, at this stage, maybe I'll just turn off my grid. Okay, so there you go. Now, this is relatively straightforward. Basically, you have a line and you have 2 points. I know it's 2 points because you actually see it there. If you don't believe me, just click and look for your components. So notice that it's currently set to primitives. If you go to points, then you can actually see the points. But if you just keep it on primitives, what happens is you can see the points by just turning on that one. Okay, so notice now that we have 2 points there. Now, these are points. What does that mean? That means if they are points, then we can do things like copy to points. And just an example, right? I'm going to create a cube. So inside my geometry level, I'm pressing tab and I'm looking for cube. And notice that there is cube there. Okay, so I have a big cube and I'll just make this smaller by just changing that. And again, how this works, everyone, is you're only viewing one object or one node at a time. So currently we're viewing the line, but if you want to view the box, then you can just make that active and now you can see the box. Okay, so what I want is to perhaps copy the box along the individual points of this line. So what I can do is, remember, we can just use copy to points. Okay, so notice what happens. Again, these are the points to copy to. So I'll just use the line and the box is the one I want to copy it to. So there you go. So notice now if that's visible, now you have, I can just turn off the points for now, but notice that it is copying it. So in fact, if your line has, let's say, 3 points, so instead of having just 2 points, it has 3. Notice you have that. If your box has, let's say, a length of 4, then notice now that, and maybe 4 points as well, or maybe let's just have it at 5 points. So notice what happens, right? Basically, from a logical perspective, what's happening is we have a line with roughly 5 points, or 5 points. And then we just have it, for each of those points, we just copied this box, copied to those individual points. So the great thing about Houdini is its non-destructive nature, meaning you can change the previous nodes and it doesn't really affect the other nodes that much. Okay, or it doesn't uh, it automatically updates, I guess, what's happening uh, along the nodes after that. So relatively straightforward. We have copy to points there. And again, relatively, again, similar to what we've done in the past. But let's just expand this knowledge of the line. Okay, so what I'll do is with that line itself, maybe I'll bring it back to 2, okay, with regards to 2 points, and maybe a length of 4, okay? Because if you have a look at the line, notice that we currently have position as its attribute. What this means is that for every single point there, we have a position. And just to prove my point, under geometry spreadsheet, notice that there's 2 points there, point 0 and point 1. And that's obvious, right? It's obvious because the points it represents are the ones in the line, and you can actually see it if I turn on, let's say, the point number. You have point 0 and you have point 1. Okay, so what's happening is, if you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, you're just seeing the position attributes of both point 0 and point 1, which is good. Okay, but the thing is, you can expand on that. And one important expansion of this line is giving them a start and giving them an end. So the thing is, you might think it's easy because we have a start there of, you think that the start is 0 and the end is 1, which is okay because we only have 2 points. But what if we have 3 points? So see, notice what happens. Instead of just having a start of 0 and 1, now our first point is point 0, and then our last point is point 13. Just to prove my point, see, 0 here and 13 here. So there you go. Okay, so maybe I'll just activate this one. So 0, 13, okay, because we have 14 points there. So with that said, right, 0 and 1 thing doesn't really give you any idea of the direction or the starting point and the end point. We know that the start is 0 and the end is 13, okay? But that is quite arbitrary or relative to the length that we have and also the number of points that we have. So what I'll do though is I'll add a very special node. I'll bring this back to 1, okay? Or sorry, 2 points, right? And I'll go back to my scene view. So we have 0 and 1 there. I'm going to use a very special node. It's called resample. And what resample allows you to do, if you just connect the line to the resample, if you make that visible, what this allows you to do is, notice everyone, by default, it adds a lot more points. And the reason why it adds a lot more points is because it's actually providing or adding segments, meaning line segments or quarters, or you could not quarters, but it's just putting segments on top of that line. So our line originally has only 2 points from point 1 or 0 and 1, but adding segments using the resample just created more points in it. Okay, so if your segment has a length of 1, then what happens is every 1 unit it creates a point. So that's 1 unit there. So again, just to show you, so see, that's between 0 and 1 is 1 unit or 1 meter. Okay, between 1 and 2 is another meter, 2 and 3 another meter, and 3 and 4 another meter. It's 1 unit or 1 meter because the length of that segment is set to 1. If the length is set to 2, then what happens is between point 0 and point 1, the distance between them is 2 units or 2 meters. Okay, so what I'll do is, maybe again, if it's, let's say, 0.5, the distance between 0 and 1 is basically 0.5 or half a unit. So that's all good, but the important thing here also is, if you expand that resample node, notice that we have a special attribute here called curve U. So it's a curve U attribute. If you activate that, notice what happens. In your geometry spreadsheet, those are the points that you have. Notice now that on top of the position, you also have curve U as an attribute. So it's an attribute of every single point you have in your line. So just to prove my point, if your line, again, has more points, meaning you resampled it and every single point line there, or every line there, or the line will have a segment every 0.5 of a unit or half a unit. So that means you have more points. And just to prove my point, under geometry spreadsheet, you have more points there from 0 to 8. And then you have position, and then you have curve U. This is important though, because notice that you have curve U. Now, if you turn this off, notice that curve U is disappears. So you're not using curve view anymore. But if you turn that on, notice what happens. It introduces this curve view. The curve view is important primarily because this allows you to know which is the starting point of the line and which is the end point of your line. So basically, starting point is 0 and the end point is 1. So just to prove my point, okay? If I, for example, do a group, okay? Sorry, not group, but do copy to points. So if I do a copy to points, and let's say, again, I have my cube there, and with my cube, I'll make that small. Let's say uniform, let's say 0.28. And again, I'm just copying it to those individual points, and then I have something like that. I'll turn off that one, and I'll turn off the points. So again, basically what's happening, right? From a logical perspective, you start off with a line. So that's line, and that from that line, you resampled it to have multiple points similar to that. Now what you did is, from those points, you just copied the box onto those individual points of the line, and now you have something like this. Okay, so relatively straightforward stuff. Now, the interesting part here is, as I mentioned, in your resample, you have now a curve view attribute. So the starting point is 0, the end point is 1. In fact, you can even change this, and I do recommend you change that name to whatever you want. So, for example, I'll just call this start end, for example. Start end, okay? And notice that 0 is the start, 1 is the end. This is important once we start having a look at the next important concept, which is groups, combining groups, and creating different types of groups. Now, before we have a look at groups, let's just expand your knowledge of lines and curves. So here, notice that I have a curve. So remember, we have a line, and inside that line, or the transform level or object level of that line, inside it is a geometry. And remember, we have a line there. And from that line, we resampled it. So we now have different segments, right? Multiple segments of that line. Now, we can copy points onto that line, or we can copy objects on those individual points of that line, but we can actually copy lines as well. So just to show you, I can do copy to points. And remember, I can use those points as my copy. And remember, you can use something like a cube, right? And with that cube, you can plug that in, and then it makes copies of itself onto those individual points. But as I mentioned, you can actually use a line on top of that. So this line, I'll make that visible. This line is pointing towards the y-axis. So it's basically horizontal or vertical in nature. So what I can do is I can just copy that line onto those individual points of this line, right? So we have multiple points there. So this is the line. Notice that I can make that the object to copy. And then notice now, when I click on this, we now have those lines duplicated onto those individual points of this original curve. Now, notice what happens though. See, if you want it visible or you want it seen together with your original curve, then it's simply just doing a merge operation. So the merge allows multiple inputs. Make sure it's visible by turning on the blue flag. And notice now that we have the copied lines and also the original line, which is horizontal there. And this allows you to create some really interesting frameworks, or perhaps a skeletal structure or a starting structure for any procedural asset you might end up creating in the future. So just to expand on that, for the line, we did do that using the y-axis, but remember, you can just do it in the x-axis or maybe the z-axis, and notice now that it does that. And then we merge it, and now we're creating that type of effect. In fact, this is all non-destructive, meaning I can do a resample, right? Remember, we can resample the line. Maybe the line is 4 units long. And then we resample it so it has segments of about 1 unit or 1 meter. And notice now that we have that effect. So that's 1 unit there, 1 unit. But since we copied it to individual points, so see, this is our original line. It has multiple segments. But then we copy that to this individual points here. And notice now that we get that effect. And now if I merge it with the original, now we have that one. And that's really good. Now, Let me just, I guess, expand this knowledge even further because there's something here that's very interesting. Okay, so just to show you, okay, what the copy to points does is actually quite special. And just to prove my point, I'll just use a cube to do a copy, right? And then with that cube, I'll just copy that cube and basically have that and then scale that. Okay, so there you go. Okay, so the copies or the box that are being copied to will actually inherit the attributes coming from the points. So remember, we have the line. The line has points similar to that. And then as I mentioned, each point has attributes. What attributes does this have now? Currently, it has the position attribute there. Okay? Now, just to prove my point, if I add, for example, a color attribute onto those points, maybe I'll add color. And maybe I'll add a color there. So I'll add a color there. So basically what it does, just give it a color of green. So what we're adding, right, is we're adding a color attribute onto those individual points, basically point 0 to point 8. If you don't believe me, have a look at the geometry spreadsheet. So again, we have point 0 to point 8. It has position attributes, but now it also has this CD attribute or color attribute. Okay, remember, we changed that to green. Now we do have another attribute there called van, and basically it's the resample node, and I'll just turn it off so it won't confuse you. So there you go. So we have that color attribute there. So as I mentioned, right, the copy to points is special because if you have a look at the copy to points tab or node, it actually inherits or copies the attribute coming from the points onto the individual objects that you're copying it to. So just to prove my point, to make it really visible, right? Remember, our curve now has a color, so individual points have color now. If I do a copy to points, notice what happens to your box. Your box will also have colors attached to it or assigned to it. So see, notice that the box, we didn't really tell it to be green. The reason why it's green now is because the points of the line, we converted that to green. We assigned it a green color. So since those individual points have a green color, if you use the copy to points to copy the box onto those individual points, the copied boxes will also inherit those points. And that's exactly what you're getting there. Okay, so now, again, it's an important concept to understand. So for example, if I just delete this color node, so for example, this color node creates those color attributes. If I delete it, so what happens is there's no color attributes anymore, it's just position. Why is this important? This is important because if you, for example, do have a line similar to what we did earlier and then copy that, notice what happens. It will also inherit the attributes coming from your original line. So what does this mean? Remember, we can do a resample, right? And under resample, there's curve view, and we can change this to whatever name we want. I just call it van. What happens is we created that van attribute. Remember, the start will be 0, the end of that curve will be 1. And what happens is, if you do a copy to points, that's exactly what will happen as well. So just to illustrate this, I'll do a resample. And I'll just change this to a value of 2. Maybe 0.5 for this. So you can see. So we did a copy to points, and now I have this. Remember, we have van attribute, and remember, the van attribute means that this point here has a van attribute of 0. This point in the end has a van attribute of 1. But since we do a copy to points, what happens is the copied lines as well, or points here, will also have the same exact attribute. Just to show you, all those points there, remember, this is the start of our, I guess, rail curve. If you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, see, all of them will have the same van attribute of 0. Just to prove my point, if you go here, all of them will have the same van attribute as well, which is 1. And that will be very important as we move forwards. So at this stage, we'll start having a look at grouping. So again, we know that grouping is a way for us to group together different components. So just a quick refresher. I'm going to create a grid there, and in that grid, I'm going to double click inside that object. And again, relatively straightforward stuff, right? Inside the geometry level, I'm going to create a group. And again, you can create a group out of primitives, or let's say out of points, and you can just specify that there. Let's say I'll create it out of points. The name of the group is called group 1. You can change it to whatever you want. But the idea behind this is, again, with that group selected, again, it's going to be a group of points. I can now select the points that are part of that group. And what I'll do is I'll just select these points here. And then I'll just press enter. And what happens is those points will now be part of that group. So how would you know what points are part of the group? So what I'll do is, the easiest way, I guess, at this stage is make sure to select the group. Press 9. So 9 allows you to see what points belong to that group. So see, notice that on group 1, these are the points belonging to that group. Okay, so not in the group, it's actually the others. Okay, so you also have a way to select the other points that are not part of the group. So relatively straightforward stuff. Now, the problem we have with this is quite a manual way of creating groups, and it's not going to give you a lot of freedom with regards to selecting points. And just to prove my point, so see, notice that we have selected the group. So in that group 1, notice that those are the points there. But the moment you change the settings of your grid, let's say I increase the number of rows and increase the number of columns, notice what happens to your group, everyone. So see this one. Notice that now it's weird. See, notice that, remember, we just selected the points here, but now that group has changed. So see, notice now it's selecting these points here. And the reason for that is, if you have a look at your point number, currently, how you're creating your points or groups, your point group, is through their point numbers there. So see, so basically 0, 1, then 10 to 12, then 20 to 22, etc. Okay, so the problem is, see, notice what happens if you start changing the parameters of the grid. See, the point numbers actually change. So see, notice that instead of having, so for example, that's 9 currently, but if you start changing things, it becomes 17, and now it becomes 18 or 34 there. So what happens is, it actually changes point numbers. So that's not an effective way of creating points. Creating point group of points. Okay, so you want a more procedural way of doing that. So this is where your knowledge of the curve will come in really handy. So again, I'm going to create a line. And remember, in that line, you can do a resample node. So maybe for this line, I'll have it, in the x-axis. So maybe something like that. And then maybe I'll hide the grid so you will see it. So I'll just turn off the grid, and then there you go. Okay, so there's our line there in the x-axis. And remember, to know, so again, your line can be long, let's say 3. Okay, and it has maybe more than 2 points. But as I mentioned, you can have it at 2 points. But the resample node can be really handy. It allows you to create segments between those lines. Okay, so let's say I have a segment that's roughly 0.5 in distance. So basically 0.5 of a unit. So another important thing here is your ability to create a curve view attribute. So curve view. Okay, so what happens is, right, with that curve view attribute, you can name that to whatever you want. So I'll just call this van, for example. And again, what that does is, in your geometry spreadsheet, every single point there. So see, you know that starting point is 0, the end point is 1 there. So to create groups procedurally, rather than relying on their point numbers, which is what you're doing when you're selecting it, you can use an attribute. The attribute is special because if you notice, everyone, even if you change the parameters or the length of that, even if you change the number or the length of the individual segments, so see, even if you change that, right? Notice that the start and the end attribute, particularly the van attribute there, remember the curve view attribute or the van when we renamed it, notice that even if you change the parameters of that, the start and the end doesn't actually change. So grouping things via attribute can be really useful when we're doing different types of procedural models. So with that said, okay, so what I can do is I can actually group both the start and the end of that point, okay, and then just have them be part of a group. So what this means is I can create a group, and in that group, this is going to be a point group. And I'll call this corners, for example, or edges. Basically, it's the corners of my line. Okay? And in that group, rather than selecting the start and the end, okay, so you can do that. You can select the start and the end, but rather than doing that, what I'll do is I'm going to rely on the attribute name. So remember, we already know that the start and the end has the start, well, a van attribute of 0 at the start, a van attribute of 1 at the end. So what I can do is I can tell Houdini, right? Using this simple expression, I'll click on at, and with at, I'll just call the attribute or specify the attribute. So at van, meaning if the van attribute is a particular value, then you can have that be part of that group. Particularly, we want the van attribute to be equal to 0, right? So if it's equal to 0, it will be part of that group. I'll just need to make sure that this is actually a point group. So going back, right here, if I go to, let's say, again, at van attribute equal to 0. So what I'll do is I'll go here under our group, and I'll just check under corner. See, notice that we are selecting that point there. So see corners, it's hard to see, but we are actually putting that point as part of that group 1. Now, as I mentioned, I don't only need van attribute to be 0, I also need van to be 1. So I basically want the corners. Okay, so basically van 0 and at van, so see, I'm just putting a space. So at van and then equal to 1. So basically, you're doing an AND. So basically, if it's 0 and it's also 1, plug that into that group. And just to prove my point, see, under corners, you're not only putting the start, you're also putting the end there. Okay? So, what this means, right? We now have a group there that only has the start and only has the end. So, what this means is now you have a procedural way of, I guess, copying points or manipulating points on the corners of that curve. So, for example, if you do a copy to points, so I can do copy to points. And maybe I'll copy a cube on each of those points, maybe a small cube. So remember, I'm going to use this as my copy and then use that as the objects I'm copying. And maybe for this, I'll just go back to, let's say, primitives and maybe make this a bit smaller. So there you go. So see, notice what happens there. Maybe 0.1. So we're just copying those points to those individual points of our line. Okay, and then we copy it. But the special thing is, notice that your copy to points actually has a target point, meaning you can specify which points you want the copying to happen. And you can specify a group for this. So if I click on this, notice that I can only specify corners. So basically what's happening is it's only duplicating or copying the box on the corners of that particular, I guess, line here. Now, why is this important? Okay? This is important because I understand that it's just one line, but let me just show you. Even if you duplicate that line, and this is where inheriting attributes will be quite useful, right? So let me just show you. So I have this line, right? And maybe for this line, it has the length of, well, the segment length of 0.5. And let's see what that looks like. So I have something like this. Okay, so you can see the points there, although it might not be that visible. But anyway, okay, so with that particular, again, we still have that curve attribute set to van, and that's fine. But what happens is if you do a copy to points, okay, and maybe you're copying the line, and you're actually copying another line on top of that. Okay, so basically this line. And I'll have that set to 1. Okay, so notice what happens, right? And maybe I'll resample this as well. And then maybe it's the length of 2. And then maybe I resampled it with a segment length of, let's say, 0.5. So maybe a segment length of 0.5. And again, I'm just copying it there and I get something like that. Okay, so again, Basically, what's happening is you have a line there, and the line have individual points, and from each of those points, you're just copying a line, another line, which is a horizontal one, a vertical one, and you're copying it to those individual points. Okay, but remember, you created a van attribute here. Okay, and remember, the copies of, or the lines, or the duplicates, or the copies you have, the individual copies you have here will also inherit that van attribute. So for example, see, under geometry spreadsheet, right? And I'll select the copy to point. See, notice that all these points here, so remember these points, and I'll just select, let's say, points here. So all of these points, these ones, see, they will also inherit the van attribute. So remember the van attribute here as a starting point, it's 0. The van attribute here is 1. So notice what happens. See, all of those van attributes for those points are actually set to 0, right? And all of those van attributes here are set to 1. So you can actually see that. Okay, so why is this important? Okay, this is important because now, right, you actually have the ability to group things. If you, let's say, want to select all of the start and all of the end there with a van attribute of 0 or van attribute of 1, what you can do is, again, you can do group, right? And what I'll do is I'll just group, again, anything with a van attribute equal to 1. And notice what happens. Again, making sure that that's points. And it's called group 1. Okay, so what happens is, see, notice now that if I press 9, see, I'm actually selecting in that group. You can see that all those points are now part of group 1. Okay, and similarly, if I change that van attribute to 0, all of those points there are now part of group 1. Okay, now if you have it at both van, at van equal to 1, notice now that you don't only have, so at van equal to 0, at van equal to 1. Okay, so notice what happens. That group also has the start and also has the end. So what this means is if you now do another copy to points, and maybe this time I'll use, let's say, a cube for that. So maybe cube. Notice what happens now. Maybe I'll scale it down. See, notice now that I get something like that, right? So relatively straightforward stuff. But in the copy to points, I can specify that only do it for the specific target points in group 1. So notice what happens. This is the start, this is the end. Notice that it only gives you the duplicates or the copies on those points there. Okay, so similar stuff. I'll even expand this a bit further. Instead of using at van equal to 1, what I'll do is I'll just say at van greater than 0. Or maybe greater than 0.5. And notice what happens, right? So if your van attribute is greater than 0.5, meaning, so see in this resample node, notice that we have points here. So see, this point has a van attribute of 0. So this one. And then 0.5. So basically this one. So these points here have a van attribute bigger than 0.5. So let's see. So basically it's these points here. So what I was able to do is I was able to group them together. So since this inherit that attribute, notice that we're selecting these points here. And basically what I did was I just copied the box into those individual points. And I get something like that. Okay, so again, see, I specified that the target points are only in group 1. In fact, if it's 0, if you didn't specify target point, it will do it for everything. But if you do specify a group there, then it just only does it for that group. Okay, so for example, in that line, let me just change that. Instead of doing it from a direction of Y, maybe I'll do it in the direction of Z. And then you can see that, I guess, oh no, not X, maybe Z. So see, there you go. Okay, so notice what happens now, and maybe I'll just increase the length of this line. And then maybe this one, I'll just have that maybe 0.5, and maybe this one, maybe this one. There you go. So maybe 4. Okay, so remember, with this copy to points, I'll just remove that. So basically what's happening is I have that, so I have this, and I'm just copying this line into those individual points. And now I have a group there, and basically I'm grouping everything with a van attribute greater than 5. So I'm looking at it, so looking at the points, basically again, see, these are the points with a van attribute bigger than 5. And then I just copied the box, let's say, to those specific points. Now I get something like this. Okay, so looks relatively straightforward. Okay, now what if I actually want to only select, let's say, so maybe what I want is to just create a group only for the corners. Okay, so basically this corner, this corner, this corner, and that corner. So this is now a bit trickier. Now, some of you will say that you can do that by just using the van attribute equal to 1 and then at van attribute equal to 0. Okay, and then if you do a copy to points and then just specify that group, notice that you have that. The problem with this one though is that's not really what I want. I don't want the middle bits here. I really just want the corner. So one corner here, one corner here, one corner, and one corner there. Okay, but I still want to maintain all the other points. So basically, I still want that. I still want all of the points there, but I really just want to copy that box on this point, on that point, on that point, on that point. Now, some of you, again, will say that you can just select. No, you can't. Because the moment, again, you start changing the parameters of the line, it won't work as well. Okay, so what do we do? This is where we can start grouping or merging together or combining together different groups. And we'll have a look at that next. So to explore combining groups, I'm going to create something simple first. Let's say I'll create a grid and go inside the grid. And again, in this grid, maybe let's have something smaller. Let's say 4 by 4. So you can see what's happening here. So I'm going to create 2 point groups. So the first point group I'm going to create, I'll just create one group here, group, and then I'll plug it in. So I'll create the first point group. And again, making sure that it's point group, and maybe I'll call it group 1, that's fine. So I'm going to select the points that are part of that group. I'll just turn off the 9 button that allows me to see the points. But in this first group, I'm going to select these points here. And then I'll press enter to select that and add that to my group. So again, this group has these points as its members. I'm going to create a second group. Now I can do this after I created the first group, meaning I'm going to create another group, plug it in here. So I basically create a second group called group 2. Again, it's going to be points. And then I'm going to again select some points. And I'm going to select these ones here. So maybe these 9 points there. And then again, I'll press enter to just make that part of that group. So what's happening here, right? If you have a look at, let's say, the members of each group. So if I select, let's say, group 1, these are the members of the group. If I select group 2, for example, these are the members of the group. So basically, we have 4 points there that are part of both group 1 and group 2. So these points in the middle. So basically 0.5, 6, 9, and 10. So they're not only part of group 1, they're also part of group 2. So as I mentioned, see, it's how I selected them. Now, combining groups allow you a lot of different ways of selecting, let's say, components inside multiple groups. So I'll just turn off my 9 button. And then what I'll do is I'm going to just look for group. And then I'm going to look for group combine. This allows us to combine different groups together. So what I'm doing is I'm activating that. I'll start with the name of this new group. I'll just call this, let's say, intersection. So maybe intersection. So maybe inter or int. Okay? So it basically asks you what your starting group is. So what is it equal to? So maybe my starting group is group 1. So basically, that's the one I want to do my operation on. It's almost like a boolean, really, if you've done used booleans before. But basically, I'll start with group 1, meaning the group here, right? So this one's here. Again, group 1, basically those points here. So I'll start with that. And then I'm going to look for other groups to perhaps manipulate group 1 with. So for example, I can select, let's say here, I can select, let's say, intersection. Or maybe union for now. So I'll just do union, let's say with group 2. So remember, the name of this group is inte, and then you have group 1 union with group 2. Basically, you're combining both. Let's see if that's actually correct. So if I press 9, go to, let's say, this group, notice now that it is correct. Now, if you don't believe me, let's have a look perhaps at blasting. So blasting specific parts or specific groups. So remember, right? If I do a blast, so notice that I can blast group 1. Okay, so notice that if I blasted group 1, so let's see what group 1 is. Okay, so there you go. So let's say I'll blast group 2. So notice that blasting group 2 allows me to have this. And then I can blast, let's say, group. Let's change this to, let's say, the int group. Okay, so notice that if I blast that one, it basically blasts. So maybe blast might not be our best option here, but I guess because we don't really have a lot of points. So if we have enough points, then the blast will work. So maybe what I'll do is instead of using the blast, maybe I'll just do a you know what? Maybe let's just do a copy to points. So copy to points, and then these are the points you want to copy. And then I'll just do a sphere, and then I'll just make the sphere small. So basically, we're copying the sphere onto those individual, I guess, individual points there. So I'll just turn that off. Okay, so I have that. Now, as I mentioned, if my target points are group 1, notice that it does that. So relatively straightforward stuff. If my target group is group 2, so it uses the bottom quadrant. But if I use group inte, this combined group that I created, notice what happens. It uses the combination of group 1 and group 2. Because basically, we're creating a union between them. So remember, in my group combine, I created a union between them. Okay, so what I'll do is maybe I'll take it a step further. Instead of using union, I'll do intersection. So why does this give you this particular result? So remember, everyone, group 1, right? So I'll just use the copy to points here. Remember, group 1 is this one, right? Group 2 is this one. Notice that, again, those 4 points are intersecting. Those 4 points are part of group 1 and group 2. And remember, we plug those 4 points into this group combine node. So we're creating an intersection between group 1 and group 2. So what's an intersection? An intersection is basically the points that are part of both group 1 and group 2. That's why when I change my copy to points to that new group we created, int, notice that it just copies the spheres onto those 4 intersecting points. Now, what if I want to do a subtract? So for example, we have group 1 and we have group 2, right? What if I want to do, let's say, a subtraction this time? Notice what happens. I get something like this. And the reason for that is simple, right? Remember, we just subtracted group 2 from group 1. So remember, this is group 2. Remember, part of that belongs to, this is group 1. Part of this belongs to group 2. So basically, group 2 is this, right? So there you go. So what we did was we just subtracted group 2 from group 1. So now in this new group, I have something like that. So that becomes a really important tool for creating, I guess, different types of effects. Now, just to show you, you can actually do 3. So let me just remove this, and maybe I'll just keep copy to points, I guess, so you can see those individual points. I'll create a third group, everyone. Okay, so my third group, so I'll just create a new one, group. So group, and then create a third group here. And then with this third group, again, is going to be points. And then I'm going to select, let's say, these ones here. Okay, so again, these ones. And then I'll just press enter. And again, we now have this quadrant, and then this quadrant here. Okay, so notice that, again, we can do a combine groups. Okay, so just to show you, see, that's group 1, then that's group 2, and then that's group 3. Okay, in fact, you can actually just add additional groups. So see, that's group 1, group 2, and group 3. So if you want all of them, you have group 1, group 2, and group 3, right? So just to show you. Now, if I, for example, use that special node again, called group combine, okay, what I can do is I can start off with, let's say, group 1. Remember, I'll call this van again, or sample, okay? And then it starts off with group 1. And maybe for my first operation, I want to combine both group 1 and group 2. So I'll do a union. I'll combine both group 1 and group 2. And then it creates that union, right, between group 1 and group 2. And just to show you, it's going to look something like this. So see, we combine both group 1 and group 2. Now, what I'll do though is here, I'll add another operation. So maybe union between group 1 and group 2, but intersecting with group 3. And notice what happens. So see, and or intersecting with group 3. So notice what happens. These ones are part of group 3. And then these ones are part of group 3, but they're also part of group 1 or group 2. So it's or. So see, now we're selecting these ones. So again, that allows us to create some really interesting effects. Now, instead of union or intersection, we can even do union, and now we have something like that. Okay? Now, again, lots of things you can do with this. Now, a common technique that you'll probably end up doing, and let me just remove that combine. Okay? So let's say we have group 1, and then we have group 2, right? So basically that quadrant and that quadrant. What if you want to select the ones that are not part of either group 1 or group 2? So I'll show you different methods for this, but perhaps the easiest for us at this stage is you can actually just create an overall group, a group that contains all of your objects. So what do I mean by that? I'll just create a new group. So there you go. And I'll call this group all. And basically, that's going to be a point group. So basically, once you have that, you don't even have to select anything here. By creating that and using, changing group name here, if you, for example, press 9, see, all of those points are now part of that group. So by default, it plugs everything to that group. And with that done, right, what you can now do is you can now add a group combine. And now my starting point, perhaps I'll just call this sample. See, so my starting point perhaps is going to be all of them, a group, the group that's called all. So basically the group that has everything in it. And then I can subtract, for example, group 1 from it. And notice what happens. So see, I can just use sample here and I have something like that. So the reason why that's happening is, again, group 1 is these points here, right? So basically, if you subtract everything from group 1, you only get these points on this side. And that's exactly what we're getting there. Okay, so again, lots of things you can do with group combine, and it creates some really good opportunities for you to create some, ways to develop certain procedural assets. And we'll have a look at that afterwards. So at this stage, let's just go back to the problem we had earlier. So remember, we're copying to points. So we're copying boxes to those individual points that we have created using this technique where, again, we have a line and then we copied another line onto those individual points, creating that effect. So if you do this, then you get that, right? So relatively straightforward stuff. But the only issue is I actually just want to copy the boxes onto those corners, meaning this point here, this point here, this point here, and this point here. So how can I do that? This is where your resample node will come in very handy. So I created a curve view attribute, right, for this line. And notice that I called it, let's say, let's just call it, let's say, line 1, or maybe I'll just call it width, for example. Okay? And then I'll just call this one length. So this resample node, so again, this one. So again, if I click on that, look at my geometry spreadsheet. So every single point you have there will have a width or curve view attribute called width. Again, the starting point is 0, the end point is 1. Okay, so relatively straightforward stuff. And then I did a copy to points. But I can also do that for the line I'm copying onto those points. So remember this line, right? We're copying that to those individual points. That line as well, we can assign a resample node. I won't use the same name. Remember, we use width here. What I'll do is I'll use another name and maybe I'll call it length. Okay, so again, with length, notice what happens. Again, the start will be 0, the end will be 1. And what this means is the start here, this point here, will be 0. So I'll just go points. This one will be 0. And let's see. So see, that's 0 length. And then this one has 1. Okay, and then it doesn't really matter if I increase the scale or the length or the size of that line. 0 and 1 will always be the same. So what happens is we now have an attribute called length and we have an attribute called width. And again, if it's in the corners, it's either 0 or 1. Okay, so let's have a look at our copy to points now. So let's have a look at this specific point here. So see, that specific point has, again, that specific point has a width attribute. So let's just, there you go. So that specific point, that's point 0, has a length attribute of 0 and the width attribute of 0 as well. Let's have a look at the other point. So this point here, notice that that has a length attribute of 0 and it also have a width attribute of 1. So this one, lastly, or maybe a couple more. So see, that one has both length and width attributes set to 1. So I mean, the other one might have, again, it's either 0 or 1. So this one has 1 for length, the 0 as width. So what does this mean? This means we can do some really, some grouping. So under my copy to points, what I can do is I can group, again, all of my points first. So it's a good idea to just group all of your points first. Or you know what? Maybe we can choose not to do that for now. Maybe I'll just create a group. And maybe I'll just call this all width, for example. So again, all width 0, for example, or 0 or 1. Or all width corners. Okay? So maybe something like that. And again, it's going to be a point group. And what I'll do is I'm going to call on that attribute. I'm going to refer to that attribute. Remember, it's called width. If it's equal to 0 and if it's equal to 1, I want you to place that in this group. Okay, so again, width equal to 0 and width equal to 1. Let's see if that actually works. Okay, so I'll just go and press 9 and then let's see. So see, notice that it's length 0 or length 1. So length 0 or length equal to 1. So see, notice now it's either this or this. So that's 0 and that's 1. Now I'm going to create another group. Okay. And then I'll call this group all length corners. So maybe, you know what, I'll just do it manually. So group. So group I'll call that all length corners. There you go. And again, it's going to be a point group. And again, this time I'm going to use length. So at length. So again, I'm using length because it's the name that I chose. It could have been any name really. So equal to 0. And also give a space. And then at length equal to 1. So make sure you're using the actual equal sign. There you go. So let's see if that actually works. So I'll just go here and activate that. And all length corners. So see, it's basically here and here. Okay? So what we're essentially able to do, right, is we're essentially able to group all the corners here. So basically, we're able to group all the perimeter points. And if you don't believe me, if we just do, let's say, a copy to points. So currently, it's copying everything, right? But I can specify. Okay, so I can specify, just use all corners. So see, there you go. And then plus all width. So to do that, I just specified this ones here. Okay, I just used those groups. So remember, all length corners and all length width. Okay, so now I have something like that. Now, that's not really what I want. So it gives me the perimeter. Now, this is important to understand, right? Because this is procedural, meaning even if I increase the length, see, it doesn't matter. If I increase the length, let's say to 8, doesn't matter. I'm still putting a copy of the box for every single point along that line. Even if I extend, let's say, the width, doesn't matter. See, since my group is procedural, it doesn't matter. I'm always selecting the perimeter of that. Okay, so that's the beauty behind this. Okay, so again, going back, right? That's not necessarily what I want. I really just want the corner. This one, this one, this one, and this one. So this is where your knowledge of group combine comes in. So if I just, for example, look for group combine, what we can do is we can go to group combine and then we just give it a name. We'll just call that corners, for example, right? We start with, let's say, the length. Doesn't really matter, length or width, length. So we create an intersection, okay? So basically, I just want points that are both in the length and in the width, okay? So what I'll do is, again, specify an intersection between all width. Remember, the only points that are part of both length and width are the corners, right? So this is the length, I think, and that's the width. So the only points that belong to both of them are the corners. Let's see if that actually works. So I'll just remove the target points here, and then I'll specify corners. Notice what happens. Now we're able to assign that box, and I'll just give it a color, right? I assign that box onto just those corners. And that's, again, the beauty behind it, right? I'm able to add those that box only on those corners. Okay, so what if we want to add the box? So another set of box or another set of boxes or maybe spheres on everything else. Okay, or maybe on the other perimeters or the other points in the perimeter. So remember, we can do that by using all length and all width. Okay, so what I'll do is maybe in a separate, so see, this is my copy to points, and it's basically for the corners. So just, this is where I can start organizing things, okay? So basically, these ones here are just for the corners. So what I can do is I can perhaps add a network box. I'll select those nodes here. I'll add a network box. And basically, those are only for my corners, okay? Now, you can change the color. So see, basically, that allows you to just group things together, makes things easier. And what I'll do is I'll press C to just perhaps change the color of that box to something like yellow. So it just allows me to organize things. So for the rest of the perimeter, again, I'm going to perhaps use another copy to points, right? And remember, for the copy to points in here, I'll perhaps just use the output again of that group combine. It doesn't mean that I'm going to use that group combined. It just means that I'm just using the output of that. And if I want to use it, I can. If I don't want to use it, it doesn't matter because I can just specify it here. And maybe I'll create a sphere. And in that sphere, I'll plug it in there. Okay, and maybe for that sphere, I'll just make that smaller. Okay, now what I want to do is only just use the corners, right? Or sorry, the perimeter. So basically, for my target points, it's basically all length and then all width. But we're not done because if you think about it, we need to combine that with this, right? So if you remember, to combine things, we just do a simple merge. We merge this one with this, and notice what happens. We get that. Now, we do have one issue, okay? One issue with this, if the scale of the sphere is big, now you start seeing the issue, right? The issue is, see, it also does the corners. So I don't want that. I only want the points that are in the perimeter, but not in the corner. So what you're able to do is you can also use group combine. Maybe we can combine group 1 and group 2 and then have them, and subtract the corners from them perhaps. So that's one way of doing it. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, so I'm going to go to group combine. I'm going to plug that here. Okay, so maybe somewhere here, right? Well, you can actually do it before everything like that. But the idea behind this is, see, similar stuff, right? I'll start with, let's say, I'll give it a name. Let's say perimeter. So perimeter. There you go. Okay, so it starts off with, let's say, the length. Okay, and then I'll add and create a union between the width. So basically, it's the width and the length. Okay, and then what I'll do on top of that is I'm going to perhaps either use another group combine, or you know what, I'll just use here and maybe do a subtraction. And basically, I'll subtract, let's say, the corners. There you go. And let's see if that actually works. Okay, if I go to copy to points, notice that again here, instead of using all of them, I'm going to just specify perimeter. And notice what happens, everyone. See, we did create the perimeter, but we're not adding the corners. Now, if I click on this, notice now that I have the corners there. And again, these are all procedural in nature, right? Meaning, if you increase the length or decrease the length, I get that. Even if you, for example, decrease and increase the line, then you probably have that as well. Okay, so with that said, okay, I have that ability to also create those corners. Let's have a look at perhaps adding a totally different, again, geometry in the inside, okay, or inside this object. So I'll just organize a few things. Okay, so maybe these are the perimeter ones. So maybe I'll just again add a network box. So maybe a network box here, give it a blue color, and then call that perimeter. So there you go. So what I'll do is, again, maybe I want to add another type of object in the middle of it. Okay, so what I'll do is maybe do another copy to points. Copy to points. Okay, but again, I'll use the output of that as my target points. And then maybe for this one, let's try using a torus or maybe a cylinder. So I'll do a cylinder or maybe tube. I think it's called tube here. Tube, plug that in, and then maybe I'll plug that and let's see what that looks like. So that is fine, a bit too big. So I'll just select the tube, make that a bit smaller, and maybe change the height a little bit, and then add a caps as well. Okay, so this is not necessarily what I want, right? So just to prove my point. So see, I can merge that. And again, that's not what I want. Because if the height is longer, see, notice that It also creates it on the areas that I already have objects on, basically the perimeter and the corners there. Okay, so how does this work? Maybe what I can do is, again, lots of ways you can go about doing this. Maybe I'll create another group. Okay, so maybe here, maybe I'll start moving things down. So perimeter, the merge, and also this one. So maybe I'll create another network box for this, and I'll call this, let's say, mid area. So maybe mid area here. Just give it a color, let's say red, for example. Okay, so that mid area there. Again, I don't want that situation, right? I only just want the cylinder in the middle area. So perhaps this is where you create another group. Maybe you can create a group here before everything. And I'll just call that group all. And basically, I'm just putting all of my points there. So this group 3, maybe I'll call it all. Again, it's going to be a group of points, and you don't even have to select anything. The moment you create a group, it will actually just add all the points in that group. But what I can do is I can create another group combine. I can do it here, but I can actually, you know what? I'll actually do it, I'll do it here. So I'll do another group, combine. So group, combine, maybe place it here. And now if you do place that there, just make sure that everything else is perhaps connected to that. So there you go. And then another is connected to that. There you go. And then I'll go call this group combine inner. Okay. And then it starts off with, let's say, all. And then I want to subtract the perimeter from it. So subtraction, I'll subtract the perimeter from it. And let's see if that actually works. So copy the points, and I'll just copy the inner points there. And notice what happens. We have, okay. So the problem is the perimeter. We might need to change that as well. So maybe here, subtraction as well. And I'll subtract, sorry, not that. Remember inner. We also subtract the perimeter, but we also subtract the corners. Okay, and notice what happens. Now we have that. Okay, so that's the great thing about that, right? Notice now that we have the ability to, again, it's all procedural in nature. I can increase that. And then this one, I can also increase that. There you go. Now, if you want to take it a step further, meaning have that also going up, what you can do is maybe have another one, right? So for example, from here, right? You want it going up. So what you can do is you can just add another line, right? And add another line here. And again, this one, it's actually going up, meaning like that. And you can increase the length to, let's say, 5. And again, you probably want some sort of attribute there, right? So you want resample again. And since we already have length and width, I'll also create a curve view attribute, and I'll call that height. Okay? And then what we can do is we can add another copy to points. So copy to points. Okay? And then again, resample, and then I'll use this one. And then let's see what it looks like. So see, notice what happens. Resample might be too much. Maybe I'll change it to, let's say, 0.5 or maybe 1 really. And notice what happens. I have that one now. Okay? So if I plug that in, I get exactly the same thing. Okay? Because see, so notice now we have something like that. Okay? So if you want the control, again, because now this is 3-dimensional, right? If you want to group not only the length, width, but including the height, so you can perhaps manipulate how objects are being copied or how objects are manipulated, you can definitely do that as well. But again, that's the idea behind this. Okay, so this is all good, and I'm able to do all of these things. But the problem we have, it's not really a problem, but the issue we have, right? Yes, it looks great and it looks all procedural, but what if we actually want real models there? So if this looks like a prototype, what if we actually want to replace them with real models. So maybe our last topic for this particular week is perhaps how to import objects. Meaning, if you, for example, prefer modeling inside Maya or Blender, and then you want to import, let's say, objects or modules in, let's say, Houdini to use in your asset, then I'll show you how to do that using, different methods. So let's have a look at that next. Okay, so as I mentioned, you don't necessarily have to model everything inside, let's say, Houdini. For example, you prefer modeling in Maya, and then you just want to bring those assets inside Houdini so you can create procedural assets. So this is an example. Notice that I have different objects created there. Although I didn't model it, I just downloaded stuff from websites like Megascans or maybe Substance. But again, basically what's happening, right, is I just have, let's say, a bar there. Okay, and then in the that bar, if you have a look at the dimensions of the bar, just be very careful. If you have, let's say, for example, if you want to use this as a procedural assets, and let's say you want it to be, stacking up one on top of the other, you just need to make sure that it's in a unit that you will be working on. This one, for example, is basically 1 unit. So 1 unit here can be 1 unit inside Houdini as well. So basically, it's 1 to 1. Although Houdini primarily works with meters. But if you have this in Maya and you didn't really specify the units, it's fine if you just have it as 1 unit, meaning, see, this is 1 unit here. So notice that it starts here and ends here. Another thing is the pivot point. Notice that the pivot point of that object is in the base. That means, right, if you end up duplicating it, so for example, me, I'm duplicating it and, for example, moving it or copying it onto, let's say, points on a line, what happens is it duplicates it that way. Okay, so there you go. So what happens is you get that particular form of duplication. So again, where you place the pivot point is quite important because, for example, if the pivot point is there and you do need to rotate it later on, it rotates in the correct anchor. If you have the pivot point somewhere in the middle, for example, now it becomes a bit more problematic because now it's rotating there. So that's not what you want, right? You want the pivot point to be somewhere there. So let's have a look at some of the other assets I have here. For example, this sidebar. Okay, notice now this sidebar, see, I can reposition it anywhere I want, right? But notice now that, again, the pivot point for that sidebar is actually located. So see, it's even wrong here. I should have just added that pivot point somewhere there, right? So see, that's my preferred pivot point. Okay, and now I guess I have something like that. And then if I do need to duplicate things, it duplicates like that. Okay, so that's good. Let's have a look at the other points there. Okay, so see, similar stuff. This is my wheels, and notice that, again, the pivot point is on the bottom. Okay, and I don't necessarily need the wheels there. But for example, this board. So see, notice that for this board, see, the pivot point is here. Okay, and the idea behind this, see, I position this properly so it actually complies with the sideboard, and because I want them to be duplicated roughly in the same way. And then this is my beam corner, for example. So see, so basically this can be my middle bar. So see, and then this is going to be my corner bars. Okay, so again, even if you created all of these assets inside a different package, right? Or even if you downloaded that, notice that it's still usable. Okay, it's totally fine. If you want to export that inside Houdini, that's good as well. Okay, but anyway, the important thing here is, again, pivot points and understanding, and also the scaling as well. So notice that for this one, because I'm planning to use it modularly, I have it at 1 unit by 1 unit. Because again, it's easier to duplicate and then copy to points if I just have that in a specified unit similar to this one. So this board is 1 unit by 1 unit. Anyway, I modeled it in Maya, or it can be in Blender, or you can even download that. But you might want to modify the scale afterwards. But anyway, I want to export that and use that inside Houdini. So how this works, see individual assets there. You probably want to delete all history for that, so it will be clean, and also freeze transform. So it's basically has clean uh, values in the translation, rotate and scale. But again, we just deleted all of those, we deleted all history. So what I'll do is I'll select all of them, maybe one or two, it doesn't matter. So for this, I want to export all of them. Select all of them. There is a special format called FBX, and that's probably my preferred format for everyone at this stage. So I'm going to go to File. I'm going to Export Selection, and I'll export it to my Houdini folder. Okay, so I have a Houdini folder, if you guys remember. And again, for my Houdini folder, I'll just plug that into my procedural assets. That's the project folder I'm working on. And then these are my, I'll just call this, these are my 3D assets. I'll just rename that. So I'll just call that assets. Okay, and then I'll just place that here. Remember, I'll use an FBX export because that's a good format that Houdini understands. So I'll just give it a name. And that is my modular, so maybe modular assets, for example. Okay, and I'll just hit export. Okay, I didn't select anything, so I'll just select that again, export it again, and then I'll call that modular assets. There you go. And then I'll hit export. Okay, so let's see how that works inside Houdini this time. Okay, so remember, I just have this, but again, I don't want it to just use simple objects. I actually want to use, modeled objects. So I don't necessarily need to model that inside Houdini. So what I'll do is I'll show you how to import that, how import objects directly into Houdini. So what I'll do is I'll just go File. Remember, we need to make sure that we actually set the project. So we, again, just make sure you set the project correctly. My project is this Houdini or these procedural assets. I'll hit accept. And then to import the 3D objects that I have, and just to, make sure that I did it correctly, this is my Houdini folder, and I need to make sure that I actually placed, right, under my assets directory, that modular asset. So I'm going to import that inside Houdini. And the correct way of doing that is going File. And under File, there's something there called Import. And under Import, go to Filmbox, FBX, and then specify where the file you want to import this. So I'll just click on this, and then look for my job directory. That's asset, and it's more modular asset. Hit accept, because there's one other thing here that you need to check. It's probably a good idea to go under here and click on Import directly into OBJ network. So it actually allows you to just import those objects directly into your scene and not create another subdirectory, or let's say it's called a subnetwork, so it doesn't create any of that subnetwork. So I'll just hit import. Okay, so notice that it did import, right? And just to prove my point, see, it imported my bar, it imported my board, and it imported, let's say, my sidebar, and then the bar corners there. Okay, so see, notice now that I have something like that. Okay, okay, now this is all good, and maybe just hide that for now. Okay, but that's not necessarily what we need at this stage. Remember, I want to replace this with, let's say, the bars that I have. Okay, so maybe for this one, I'll just turn on copy. So maybe this one's, instead of using a box, I actually want to use that sidebar or that main bar that I created. So remember, we imported it, and those are separate objects in our objects. This is where we can use a special node called merge object. So our object merge, I think. So if you, again, go to your geometry level and look for tab object merge. So I'll do that one more time. So here, right? So press tab, look for object. And there's something there called object merge. Basically, it allows you to import or merge an object from a separate node or a separate geometry inside this geometry level. So inside this geometry, I can import another geometry within my Houdini, network. So what I'll do is, again, here, object merge, I'll look for that. maybe I think I called it main bar. So I'll just call that main bar. I'll just select main bar there. Again, I imported that using my FBX file. I'll hit accept. And just to prove my point, see, there it is. Okay, so there is my main bar there. Okay, so that's good. So what I'll do, instead of using the box, I'll actually use that main bar. And let's see if that actually gives me the correct results. Okay, so notice what happens. It does give me the correct results, everyone. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll just adjust some of the settings I have here. So we'll have something small. So maybe for my line, maybe instead of a length of 5, maybe I'll do 2. And maybe for this one, instead of 7, I'll do 3. And maybe instead of, let's say, a line of 5, let's try 3 as well. So notice what happens there. I have something like that now. Okay? Now, for the perimeter, maybe I'll use another bar, perhaps. So again, remember, instead of using the sphere, I can just perhaps use, again, an object merge. Object merge. And then, remember, for this one, perhaps I'll use maybe the sidebar this time. Hit accept. Again, and then instead of using the sphere, I'll use that one. Plug that in. And let's see if that actually works. So I think that's sidebar, and then let's have a look at the merge. Okay, so maybe not the sidebar. Maybe I'll actually end up using the, the other one. The main bar and then beam, maybe beam corner. Okay, so see guys, then there you have it, right? So now I have, I guess, something like that. And maybe for the length, okay, so there you go. So now I have something like that. So for the individual or for the inside ones, okay, so basically the mid area, instead of using the tube, maybe I'll use that board thing there. So what I'll do is I'll go object merge again, okay, and let's try using the board. And let's see if, again, board, hit accept, and then plug that in. And let's see if that actually works. So see, notice now that it did work, object merge, and I guess I have something like that. Okay. Now, it's not perfect, right? Notice that we might need to modify a few things. Okay. So maybe, for example, we might need to, let's see, instead of doing inner, let's see what it looks like if I didn't use anything. So see guys, that actually works really well. But what I want to do is probably not use, so maybe it's actually the size of my board. So let's see. Let me just see what I can do here. So maybe increase the length. Or maybe I'll change this to 4. So I have 4. The length is 4 there. And then maybe I'll do... you know what? This is actually correct. The only issue I have is, remember we did the grouping where we specify the corners. The only issue, see, the corners there, you also need to also perhaps, remember we have a height. We also want to create a group, maybe in group 3. Remember all corners or R length and then all width. So we probably want to create another group that includes all height. So we can just isolate the perimeter, the corners, and stuff like that. So it's actually working. Okay, so notice now, it's actually working really well. And I have something like, that looks like this one. Okay, so if you actually end up creating an asset, okay, so maybe I'll save this. Okay, if you actually end up creating a sample asset, right? Remember what you need to do? Again, even if you have third-party models there, it's fine. Okay? What you need to do is you need to select everything that's supposed to be part of that asset. So basically, all of that, right? And then what I'll do is I'm going to go to asset, and then I'll just create a new digital asset from selection. Again, specifying where I'm saving it. I'm plugging it in my job directory. And then for this one, I'll just go and maybe I'll just save it in my assets directory. And I'll just give it a name. Again, it's going to be HDA and C because it's non-commercial. And then I'll give it a name. I'll call that bench or, shelf creator. Okay, and then hit accept and then give it a name. So maybe shelf. Okay, and then namespace is fine. So I'll just specify a jobs. So save directory is not on the hood. So let's just set the path. So set the project properly. So this one, accept, then specify the path. It's fine for this one, assets, accept. That should be okay. And again, I'll just hit create. Again, you might get this error, and the reason you're getting this error is because you have objects coming from other sources, not internal to Houdini. So for now, I'll just hit OK, and that's fine. Okay? And then again, what you end up doing, right, is see, we're going to start adding parameters that you need. So for example, inside, if you want to, let's say, control the length and the height, remember, it's actually the line, right? The line to length that you need to add. So again, this is maybe the width. So so I'm not quite sure if that's the width. But anyway, I'll just drag to the root. Again, I'll just call this shelf width, for example. And then I'll give it a name, a label as well, shelf width. Okay, and then I'll hit apply. And again, you'll get that error because again, we're using another object. So I'll hit OK. And then maybe I'll add another one, maybe this one. And again, it's length, left mouse button, drag it there. And then basically this is my shelf length. Okay, shelf length. Now, be careful with this one though. You just need to make sure that you set the project properly every single time for this to work. Okay, so make sure to set the project correctly, right? And then I'll just copy this name and then paste it here. And then there you go. And then hit accept, apply. Okay, and okay, and then hit accept. Let's see if this actually, I'll just, again, error because, again, you have a third party object assigned there, but it's okay. So I'll just close it. And let's see if this actually works. Okay, remember, we have that shelf asset, remember, width. So we have width. See, notice that it is working well. And we also have shelf length. And then notice that it is working well also. Okay, so notice now that again, see, this is actually modeled really well. So see, notice that you have that, and then you have those other objects there. Okay, so again, that's how you use some of the techniques we've covered. Okay, now then what we'll have a look at is the challenge you have for week 2. So for our week 2 challenge, again, it's worth up to 10 points. What I need you to do is recreate, okay? I'm going to give you the assets. I'm actually going to give you the assets for this shelf creator, but I want you to use that assets together with what you know about grouping and copy to points to create, I guess, a prototype of your shelf. Again, you're going to showcase this by giving me a screen recording or a demo video of the asset that you created. So see, notice that I have a shelf creator there, and then I can increase, let's say, the width, the length, and the height of that, and it allowed me to create that. So see, notice that the complexity of that particular asset is the corners are different from the bars being used here, and I also have the boards, and you can add even wheels and other more complicated stuff in it. Okay, so again, recreate this particular asset. Now, on top of that, again, as I mentioned, okay, that's your challenge, and maybe I'll just share this inside Teams. So I'm going to go and copy that. Again, do a recording, showcase that in Teams. In fact, I'll even do it here where I'll go to week 2, start the post, and then I'll just announcements. And then this is going to be week 2 challenge at HSE. And then I'll just um, post that. There you go. And then on top of that, what I'll do is I'm going to also share, the video, the example video there. Okay. So hopefully that's clear with regards to what you need to do. Again, showcase that particular asset. It is, I guess, if you're able to do this, you're able to start working on your assessment, and on top of that, earn points for assessment one. So looking forward to seeing your example assets there. Again, even if you get an error because we are using third-party objects, that's fine. But just make sure to set your projects properly because it's constantly going to look for that asset. So hopefully that's clear.